Hello, hello, friends, and welcome back to Artist Questions. This is the mostly weekly live stream where we look at some of the biggest questions facing contemporary artists today. My name's Dan Curtis. I'm an artist, writer, and arts educator from London in the UK, and this is all made possible by the amazing Bonk Art Masters and Exchange Art, of where I am currently, head of education for artists and collectors. So lovely to see you all this week. And this week we are going to be following on a little bit from the last few weeks mini series that I did on smashing imposter syndrome. And we are going to look at the idea of artistic play, as that seemed to be feeding a lot into last week's episode and a lot of the questions around feeling like you're not kind of a serious or real artist if you sort of need to experiment anymore, and that that you should just know what you're doing and that there's no time for things like playing around and mucking around with materials and things like that. And I'm going to show you today that that's not the case, hopefully. So what I want us to do then is look at today's question, which is not just about artistic play generally, but the question is, why does artistic play or experimentation, trial and error, feel so impossible? And not just generally, but in our contemporary culture, why does it feel harder than ever to be able to play and experiment with materials, ideas, processes without a knowledge of where they are going to go? So I want to have a look at, there's millions of answers to this question in a way, but I want to look at what I think could be some of the key reasons why you might be feeling blocked in terms of your experimentation or finding the idea of playing or allowing yourself and giving yourself the space to experiment, why that might be feeling really difficult for you, and some ideas, both internal and external, about that. And then I want to think about a positive reframing for all of that. So, another way that we can look at the idea of experimentation that can hopefully get us reset into knowing that play is actually a really serious and important act as an artist, and what it all means for artists today. I've got 1,000,000,001 notes, so we'll see what we get through. As usual, just lots of new ideas and things I'm thinking about and reading. So hopefully something will resonate with you. And anytime you've got any questions or any thoughts like that, on Twitter and on YouTube, the chat is both open on both of those. So please feel free to drop a question or a comment or a disagreement or anything, anytime, clarification, anything like that. Let me know, and I'll be able to bring it up here on the screen so we can see your question. So then, why does artistic play feel so impossible at the moment for artists? I think it's worth beginning with actually the way I began with last week's session, which was looking at Amy McNee's book, We Need Your Art, the writer, activist, and artist. And she was saying there's a kind of question that lingers in our minds that play feels, and art making and artistic play and experimentation and not knowing where it's going and not creating value feels like childlike and stupid, both in the sense that educationally that's often what we're told, that those kind of things are for children and to stay there, not for the real world. And on the other hand, that why would we do abstract paintings, embroidery, write books about, forest fairies or anything like that, when the world is figuratively and literally on fire, when we're living through some of the worst times we can imagine, when we're seeing terrible things happening. And we talked a lot about that last week, and I would recommend going back and looking at the idea of frivolity and the idea that prettiness and beauty and experimentation are antidotes to that. But something that I want to just touch on here is if we're beginning to feel like play is stupid, that we've got to remember, as Amy says, that in a culture that demands passivity from us and consumption or endless value creation productivity, that being explorative, curious, open, and just experimenting and playing actually becomes a radical act, a political act in a culture that demands you to consume, creating and experimenting without a clear product at the end of it actually brings you back in line with who you are outside of surveillance capitalism. And we're going to get into that a bit more as we go along. So that might be one reason you're seeing it as stupid or childlike to think that way, and that serious artists would just know what they're making. Or you would feel like, well, the world's on fire, so how can I do it? Another reason why you might be finding it difficult to experiment in the studio is because of the reinforcement of genius mythologies through our culture. Now, we have kind of dropped, in some sense, the idea of the artist as genius. As I guess it's there in some elements of culture, maybe TV, and in some people's minds that people sort of see artists as tortured geniuses or sort of bohemian, sort of airhead types sitting in rooms smoking pipes, and suddenly, the muse disseminates that art through you, and that's how you become a real great artist or something like that. That still exists a little bit, but I think we're dropping it slowly. But I think it has been replaced by something else, and that's the idea of, I'm sure you've come across the idea of the 10,000 hours before. I can't remember where it came from, that book, but there's this idea that if you want to be great at anything, if you want to be a master or genius, then you've got to put in your 10,000 hours, that you've got to focus on this singular thing and drive at it for 10,000 hours, and then you'll be the best in the world. And there's an amazing book by a author and journalist called David Epstein, and the book's called Range, and it's about why generalists, rather than those who specialize early, become have a much more fulfilled and active and productive, I guess, life than those who become specialists early on. And so what he's saying is all the research that we have about people who've produced some of the most amazing art in the world, or even people in sports or writing or anything else like that, all suggest that these people spent many, many years of their life before sort of landing on amazing works that they made, experimenting, playing, trying a plethora of different activities, trying all sorts of things out. And he gives a couple of examples, like Van Gogh, he gives an example of, who only really started painting in his late 40s, and before that had done a number of different careers. And in his writings, he talks about each of those things that he was doing as, this is the thing that I'm going to do, this is the one thing. And actually, through experimenting all this stuff and coming to painting at that later date, it worked out pretty well in terms of the work that he made. He also talks about Roger Federer, the tennis player, who had grown up not really playing tennis at all. In fact, his mother wouldn't teach him tennis because he didn't serve the ball well, or something like that. She was a tennis instructor. So he tried skateboarding, and then he moved on to wrestling, and then basketball, played that for a number of years, all this kind of stuff. But we would see him as this, someone like Federer is like this, genius, figure who's this, has his mythology around him. He's so practiced, he's so incredible. But actually, he spent, so many years of his life experimenting with everything. And the range, as the book suggests, that gave him, brought in the capacity for him to be brilliant at what he was. The problem is, David Epstein says, is that story is not very marketable. That story is not really doesn't brand very well. And the 10,000 hours story, instead, the specialist who only focuses on one thing forever and doesn't experiment and doesn't play and is just focused on this one idea, is much easier to apply to ourselves when we're feeling psychologically worn down and worried about our future, because we can say, oh, that's all I need to do. I just need to apply 10,000 hours to this one thing, not have a range of experimentation. And he uses an example of like Tiger Woods is like the poster child for this idea that Tiger Woods was given, his first club, golf club when he was. If you don't know who Tiger Woods is, he's a very famous golfer, and he was given his first club when he was 4 years old, and then he was raised by his parents to keep trying, and by 18 he's become a champion, and by 21 he's like world champion. He's the best in the world, something like that. And it's this kind of idea which is so rare, that kind of person. And Tiger Woods in himself is a problematic figure for so many reasons, right? But it's that kind of figure that sticks out to us, and we kind of think that, well, we can't play and muck around and try things out and study different stuff and read things and experiment in the studio. We need to do our have our golf club from when we were 4 years old. In fact, it's probably too late. I'm 25, I'm 35, I'm 45. It's all past, for me to become a great artist or something like that. But Epstein's saying complete opposite is true, but it doesn't brand well. So there's a high possibility that one of the reasons you're finding artistic play so difficult and the idea of experimentation is because of genius mythology that is pushed in our face all the time. But in fact, those with a range of skills, interests, passions, being a fucking artist, that's where the some of the greatest work lies. So that could be one reason. Excuse me. Another reason why you might be feeling that artistic play feels so impossible is back to the work of the amazing social and political theorist and journalist and music writer Mark Fisher, who we talked a little bit about last week, and we're going to expand on a bit more now. And in his book Capitalist Realism and in his book Ghosts of My Life, he talks a lot about the idea of both the retreat into the past at times of crisis, but also a sense that there is also a lament for lost futures. So let me explain that a bit more. What he's saying is that many people now have a sense that the futures that seemed to be on the horizon for us, say at the end of the 20th century and just the beginning of the 21st century, seems now to have evaporated. In fact, that's a quote from his book, "The future has evaporated." There doesn't and what his famous quote, is famous for putting the quote out, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And the future for many people feels dystopian, feels like we're just driving to, destroying and exploding everything. And the things of like the excitement and the promise that was to come seems to be gone. And so actually we are in a place of lamenting a future that never came, as well as maybe lamenting a past that we feel we should have engaged with. And that can put us to a point of, well, what's the point then? So when it comes to things like artistic play, if we are seeing like ahead of us dystopia and behind us like sort of imagined nostalgic ideas of something that should have been, or I should have been there, we can lead to, well, what's the point of play when everything's on fire and falling apart? And what that leads to, he says, is an inability to imagine the new. And that's why he suggests that so much art and music and culture feels like it's just constantly resampling itself. Why we're seeing the same redos of the same ideas, why we see the 15th series of Downton Abbey or whatever, just these continuing repeating of old ideas, why we see artists, music artists sampling a song that's only 5 or 10 years old and it repeating it again as if it's like a new thing when it isn't. It's just an endless cycle of internal looking. And he's saying that comes from in the end of the 20th century, perfect, the government wasn't funding all arts or something like that, but that most art schools were free or had minimal costs. And that meant that working class people, middle class, and the bourgeoisie could all go to the same art school, begin mixing, and that's when incredible music and art start to emerge. And he's saying it's interesting because at that time, think about 60s, 70s, 80s, there's actually there's a sound for each of those time periods, like sonically. There was so much of the new happening and people imagining the new that you can actually pretty much pinpoint almost to the month, sometimes he was saying, of the sound of that time. He's, as a music journalist, he's often talking about it in a musical terms, but I think we can see that in terms of art as well. And when you think about what's the sound of the 2000s or what's the sound of the 2020s, it's like it doesn't exist anymore. Everything is like a plethora, and there isn't much new sonic or artistic imagination occurring because there isn't space to imagine the new, because capitalist realism has kept us so locked in to a space of lack and a space of fear and a space of competition, and the attention economy rules over everything that we're doing, that it's so hard to think about playing, experimenting, imagining the new, when you just feel like you're trying to survive, or you just feel like that you are fighting for the scraps of minor attention that we can get through social media, or the small amounts of funding that are left in a culture that devalues art so much while valuing things like high levels of wealth being dragged upwards, etc., etc. So this struggle, Mark Fisher is saying, with capitalist realism and the fact that there's so little support for artists, and tuition fees are not that old. They were introduced by New Labour, I think it was in 2008, wasn't it, in the UK? And they've only gone up and up in cost, so that it's only now that bourgeoisie, the highest tiers of society, that can even go to art school in the first place, unless you're super, super lucky, like I was, and got a scholarship to be able to go to my master's. Otherwise, I never would have been able to afford it. And it means that then we're not mixing and there's not anything new occurring, and it's actually just going to college to pay exorbitant amounts of money for very small amounts of space, and then to kind of get the name added at the end of your work. That's obviously a very cynical look at it, but it's very different to the late 20th century, which was then birthed a lot of new creations. What's happening then is, what he's seeing is the retreat into two things. One is the repeatability. So for the feel for us as artists, that we can't experiment wildly and do things new, because what if my audience doesn't get it? What if a gallery won't represent me, because I can't repeat the same things over and over, and I've got to be, when people are scrolling, they've got to know that it's me. If I do something wildly different, then it won't make sense. We talked a bit more about that last week, so feel free to go and watch that one as well. And that's capitalist language, attention economy working itself out. And the second then is the nostalgia, as I was describing, the endless resampling of life. And I think we can then start to resample ourselves as artists out of fear of trying something new, because we're so stuck inside this capitalist realist environment and framework. What that then leads to, I think, which is quite interesting, is that I think when you think about the fear around AI for a lot of artists, I think one reason that AI is able to so easily repeat or create what is out there in culture at the moment, whether that's kind of illustration styles or forms of music, I think, it's not just because of the massive data sets that are scraped to make AI work. It's also because so much music and art sounds exactly the same, because we're stuck in this sort of nostalgic time loop where we can't reimagine the new. It's so easy for an AI to find patterns between things. That's a theory I've got anyway. I don't know if you agree with that, but when we can't imagine the new, it's perfect fertile ground for something like AI to just take up the reins and make as much money out of it as possible, because it's so easily repeatable. Okay, how are we doing? We're all right there. Thank you if you've joined since I started. Questions are open, so feel free to drop anything in if you'd like to. Connected to that, then, when we're talking about the attention economy and capitalist realism, is also another thing that might be making it hard for you to think about experimenting and playing as an artist anymore, is because of what we could call surveillance capitalism. This is a sense, like, through things like social media and the attention economy, that you are constantly being watched by an audience at all times. And it might be even just an audience that's in your mind, because you are constantly in a space where you're thinking each thing I do must be performable, must show value, or must show progress, or must show that my life's together, or something like that. And the idea of, like, roughness and trying things out and experimentation doesn't really fit into surveillance capitalism, which requires us to be showing up in the correct way. And I think that feeling of constantly being watched then leaks into the studio. And as you're trying to experiment and play something, you're like, yeah, but will people get this? Will it make sense to my audience? Or if I do this, how am I going to photograph it for it to fit on my Instagram page? Or how should I be making a reel while I do this? And it constantly, like, colonizes our entire life. It gets inside of our heads and keeps blocking us from being able to experiment and doing what we're doing. And then you get that strange, funny thing then, when the sort of attention economy colonizes everything in your work. It sort of gets in the way of your making process, as I was just describing. And you feel like you're totally surrounded, on the one hand, being watched by all these imaginary people around you. But at the same time, you become extremely isolated and lonely, because you're not actually connecting with anyone on a real basis. And both of those things can kind of drive you insane, it feels like. So surveillance capitalism might be a huge issue in terms of how you're viewing experimentation. Okay, last few little things before we think about reframing. There might be, this is a brand new thought, right? So tell me what you think to this. I was thinking one reason that a lot of artists, I think, struggle with play is that play and experimentation, as well as not feeling like something that can be really shown, maybe like from a surveillance capitalist viewpoint, it's also something that feels so unresolved, and which is literally the point of it, right? But also it feels then something that's very minor, something that's not making a big impact. And I think when it comes to the attention economy and how much cultural products that are put out these days are talked about, it's all about how big it is, right? So, for example, me and my son went to see the new Wicked film last week. And basically, his class and a lot of other schools in London were part of this film festival, were given like free tickets to go and see a film. It's called the Interfilm Film Festival, with the idea of promoting film to young people, which is great. And we saw some animations created by school children and stuff on the massive mega screen. It was really, really cool. But the film that we'd been given tickets to was Wicked 2. It's called Wicked for Good, the new one, the second half of the Wicked story, and which is a musical, if you're not familiar with it, which has been running in London and I think in New York for many, many years. Anyway, the head of Universal, is it? I think, who produced the Wicked film, head of Universal Studios UK, she was there to talk about the film. And interestingly, she only said she said three things actually about the film to, like, promote it and talk about why it was so amazing to the children. She talked about that over 10,000 people or something like that had worked on the film. It's this huge number. She talked about that the box office sales for it were the biggest film in the UK this year, and everyone's, clapping and cheering. Then she talked about how in one scene in the film, there's this massive tulip field that like some characters are running through, and they didn't want to do it with CGI. They wanted to make it real, so they planted 1 million tulip bulbs to get this absolutely monstrous massive scene. And she talked about 1 million tulip bulbs were planted for this scene. So you can see the three things that she mentioned were all about size, scale, money, how much money it had made, how many people had seen it, how many million tulip bulbs there were. And I just thought, like, is that the point of this whole thing? You know, is that the point of why this musical was written originally, or why this film was made? You know, the whole film is about identity and, you know, connecting with good and evil, and what makes a person real and what makes a person good, and something like all those kind of things. It's really in-depth, interesting storytelling, but the way she kind of brought it out was like, it's all about scale and size, and the way that they've rendered this film is just like bigger all the time. And you're going kind of like down two routes with so much of modern film culture in particular, or you know, programming. You're going down the kind of multi-million pound, million tulips in a field size thing, or you go to sort of the Netflixification of things, they call it, don't they, where it's like the subject matter is so lax and so weak that you're able to do what they call dual screening. So you can scroll on Instagram while watching this program at the same time. It's kind of made for multi-screen viewing, right? And I just think that that really plays into our thoughts about play, artistic play, because I think sometimes we feel that artistic play is not 1 million tulip bulbs in a field, right? And we're not doing something that creates this level of impact. So what's the point of fucking around in the studio with paint or fabric, or doing a silly little collage or whatever, you know, to get ourselves inspired? It can feel like we're not doing something big or important. The problem is with this sort of stuff is twofold. I think on the one hand, when you think of 1 million tulip bulbs planted for the, you know, Wicked second film, I think, yes, they were 1 million tulip bulbs planted, but by who? Do you know what I mean? And then, you know, this guy who's obviously been paid like exorbitant amounts of money to do the design for this film is saying, you know, we worked with the local people to plant the 1 million tulips. And I'm like, who are these local people? Who is the labor force, you know, behind this vision that you have? And that the fact that you had to do it with real tulips, yes, it's kind of extravagant and amazing, and in some sense. And on the other side, I'm like, who's made that happen? You know, and I just, the ethics of it just really make me feel really strange. And the fact that that's promoted as the most important like part of the art is like how many million people worked on it, and how much labor they could, probably underpaid labor, they could make happen to make it work, and where did all the tulips go, and all these questions I have. So that's the one. um I just think that is, when it comes to like big projects, that's like the one side of it. The other side is that there used to be, I guess, and this is not a nostalgic thing, but it's just a thing that's changed when we think about playfulness as artists. There used to be a very strong idea around the idea of selling out, that you sort of, if you went to where the money was, or, you know, where bigger things were, and you started making things commodifiable and sellable all over the place, that you were like a sellout, right? I think with sort of modern artistic or creative culture, even things like, let's say, YouTubers and things like that, where it's all about how many millions of pounds or millions of views you've got, and these kind of films like I was discussing, there isn't this idea of selling out anymore. That seems to have passed. And actually the idea of, you know, being constantly productive and making a lot of money from your art, and then showing off your amazing big studio in your really cool clothes and your big paintings and stuff like that, is actually like, becomes like something we compare and despair with on social media, and think, why am I not there? Instead of like questioning it in the first place and saying like, is that actually what any of us really wants, you know, to be as mega famous and rich as possible? You know, we start to see like, oh, that's a real artist, someone who sells their work for high figures, not someone who imagines the new and reshapes culture, or thinks about experimentation with no end, thinks about curiosity with no result in mind. We think, no, this is what a real artist would do, is like this sort of mega sales force, you know. And And we end up, as I've said so many times, comparing ourselves to artists that we've got no idea how their lives work, or why they've got so much money, or how they're able to afford the time and space to do all this stuff. When, like Mark Fisher's saying, so much of us are stuck in not being able to imagine the new because we're simply trying to keep up with capitalism. Okay. So when this idea of productivity, of attention economy, of capitalist realism, of the idea that we can't imagine anything new because everything feels so dystopic, and productivity has colonized our entire beings, and we feel like we've got our audience around us in the studio all the time, and we're anxious when we rest because we feel like we should be working, then we're anxious when we try and play because we feel like it's not real work, and then we're anxious when we do work because we don't feel like we're doing enough. It's just never ending, and it's no wonder that we feel so exhausted and find things like just sitting down and making marks and seeing where they go, or just cutting up paper and collaging with no plan in mind. No wonder that we find that so difficult. So then, with all that in mind, how can we reframe in a positive way and think about reclaiming the act of play for ourselves as artists? Well, let's come back to Fisher and capitalist realism. In terms of thinking about not being able to imagine the new, he's saying in the closing of capitalist realism, the book, that it isn't, this way of living isn't inevitable. It's kind of a spell that's been put upon us. It's not a law, because as he says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But capitalism is not that it's like inescapable, it's that we've been convinced that this is the best we're going to get, that this is all that we've got, to work with. But if imagination then has been constrained by that, it shows also that imagination is there and can be expanded again. Yeah. And he's saying that capitalist realism is a psychological and cultural condition, manifested by these frameworks around us. It's not a natural state of being, and therefore it can be undone. But therefore it's not just kind of depicting the world as it is, or as artists, that's all we've got to work with. Actually, irritating the limits of imagination is what is important. Proposing forms or feelings that don't fit in the current order is what it means to imagine the new. And of course, we don't do that alone, because as Fisher keeps saying in the book, the future is built through community, not lone genius, as we were discussing earlier. So then Fisher's kind of optimism in the book is that collective imagination. And I think then collective play is the real site of transformation for us as creatives, is the real site of making a fucking difference, whether it's just in our own lives, in the lives of those who are interested and need our work, or in a larger scale, whatever it is, all of which are legitimate. The collective imagination and collective play is where we're going to find the true sort of change, the newness that we're looking for. By embodying the new, not via the attention economy or perfectionism, or not allowing ourselves to play, and not through competition with other artists for these limited forms of attention, or not in compare and despair cycles, all of which isolate us from each other. If we can collectively experiment and play together, and hopefully by me telling you this today and saying you can do it, that you can find each other, and me explaining that I feel the same as you, I hope you can see that, which is what we talked about with imposter syndrome. All of the solutions to imposter syndrome and thinking about these frameworks of the attention economy sucking things out of us is all about coming back together and saying, yeah, we feel the same, and therefore we can both play the same too and imagine the same. So that's Fisher's sort of reframe it, this sort of re-enchanting of imagination, and that the future will be built through collective imagination, and by irritating the limits of your imagination, not getting constrained within, I have to only imagine in this way because otherwise I can't make money from it. That's Fisher. And I also want to, in closing, then we've got about 5-10 minutes left, In closing, I want to talk about the American artist and writer Jenny Odell. And I'm going to be doing a little bit more on her work next week, hopefully, and thinking about the idea of refusing the attention economy altogether as artists and how we can do that. But I want you to talk a little bit about her research now, just in closing, but I will do more next week. So Jenny Odell is an American multidisciplinary artist, makes really interesting work. She's also a writer and educator, and she was, I believe, I've written it here. Oh yeah, she was she taught internet art and digital physical design at Stanford University for about 10 years or so. And she also wrote the book How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, which is a fascinating and incredible book. And it is, written from an artist's perspective. It can really apply to anyone, but she uses so many artist examples in there of what that can begin to look like, and then reframing what it means for us to reclaim our attention, which I think allows us to play, which is like my theory on top of this, is that when we begin to reclaim our attention from the attention economy and from searching for these like perfectionism in compare and despair cycles that capitalism wants us to be fighting against each other, that when we can reclaim attention, we can redevelop our imagination and our chance for play. So a book is all about, it's not actually about doing nothing. What it's about is refusing the attention economy and stepping out of the kind of constant push to produce, optimize, monetize, and perform, so that we can recover deeper forms of attention and therefore meaning and connection. And then what I'm saying is, and therefore play as well, and experimentation. So Odell in the book talks about how digital capitalism, which the attention economy is part of, which capitalist realism is part of, wants us to be continuously efficient, visible, and endlessly productive. Visible is really important here because play needs to be done in community, but it needs to be done with a freedom of judgment. And the idea of being constantly visible, like this audience living in your head, living in your studio from the attention economy, as I was describing, makes it so hard. Because with those things in place, needing to be efficient, visible, productive, it erodes our ability to notice things around us and start to make the connections and experimentations that artists need to make stuff work. It erodes our capacity to care about those things, particularly then if you link it back to Fisher's work and the idea of not being able to imagine the new. In that sense of dystopian futures, we start to think, oh, what's the fucking point of caring about anything, because it's all going to shit anyway. So therefore it limits our curiosity and then our playfulness, and ultimately within that our full humanity. So a lot of our humanity is colonized by the attention economy and capitalism. That's making it so hard for us to experiment. So therefore doing nothing is actually about reclaiming attention. So she talks about even the simple acts of looking at birds, noticing your neighborhood, spending time in unoptimized physical environments, allowing boredom, following curiosity with no outcome in mind. There's not laziness or stupidness or unproductivity. It's political because it's a withdrawal from an economy that tries to turn every second of your fucking life into productivity. And therefore, for us as artists, every second in the studio must count all the time. She also has this really interesting idea that attention is relational, not extractive. Yeah. So also we might start to think, like I said, if we can continuously think of ourselves as lone vessel genius artists, even when it comes back to reclaiming our attention or trying to play personally, yes, we need that time to do it in ourselves. But what we might become is that we might start to think, because if I do this, then I will be able to extract the most value from the experimentation, then that will make the best work, and then I can be liked on Instagram and I can sell, etc., etc. It all like more isolation. But she draws on ecological thinking, so thinking that things are interconnected, yeah, and that real attention is situated in place, in around us, in community, and it's reciprocal. It's done in community with each other, and it's slow, which is complete opposite of the attention economy. Yeah. And of course, it contrasts sharply with capitalism's version of attention, which is fast, shallow, instrumental, and then I would say repeatable as well. And you get this kind of internal nostalgia, as we were talking about earlier with Fisher and Reynolds' work. So we need to then think about how play then becomes political, is what Odell is talking about. Because free, unstructured play and experimentation is one of the few spaces that capitalism struggles to commodify, because it's not brandable, it's not repeatable. So play reopens pathways literally in our mind and our bodies and our work to experimentation, surprise, absurdity. And absurdity is vital to artistic life. Here's a great quote from her. Our attention is what we have to give. Where we put it determines what kind of world we create. I began to realize that the things that feel like nothing, being in the park, watching birds, experimenting, playing, were not nothing at all. They were the basis of my ability to think, to reflect, and to create. Yes, friends, the basis of your ability to think, reflect, and create as an artist is not in solopreneur perfect production of work. It is in the idea of doing nothing, of allowing things to emerge, of being slow, of being experimental, slow observation, collecting thoughts, following side trails, being present, finding your own rhythm, making things that are not optimized for algorithms, thinking about what matters to you, not what sells, reconnecting with the world in ways that inspire your work, looking at community-based alternatives, caring for things rather than consuming them all the time, and making art that isn't market-led. So doing nothing, therefore, is what she's saying, is protects your sense of self. Not only that, builds your sense of self. So another quote from her, when you are no longer a target for advertisers, you become a person again. Couldn't say any better than that, really, could you? So in that sense, doing nothing becomes a tool for creating space where authentic art can emerge. Okay, so more on Odell next week and more thinking about resisting the attention economy as artists. But I hope that's given you some reframe this week in thinking about play, in thinking about how you might review experimentation as a maker, and how you might give yourself what am I trying to say? Say it as simple as this: just let yourself play, let yourself experiment, because you truly are building the foundations of your work, and your ability to think properly and your ability to create comes from that. You need to be able to play and experiment as an artist, and it is an act of political resistance to do so. Thank you for being here, friends. I hope to see you next week. And then I think it's going to be Christmas holidays after that, isn't it? Maybe we got 2 more. I don't know. I'll let you know next week. But love you all. Thanks for being here, and see you in the next one. Bye for now.